Donald Trump has been back in power for 3 months or less, and there have been many shocking authoritarian moments. But what we just saw in the Oval Office was perhaps the most shocking and most authoritarian for a number of different reasons. Because Donald Trump just met with President Bukele of El Salvador. This man is a right-wing populist and authoritarian, and he's also the one who received the unlawfully deported Maryland father, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. You may recall, because we've been discussing this story, that the Supreme Court of the United States unanimously ordered the Trump administration to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia, who was, again, unlawfully deported to El Salvador. So, of course, during this Oval Office meeting, the press asked both Donald Trump and Bukele about this. And Bukele says no, he will not be returning Abrego Garcia. And Donald Trump and the Trump administration seem to be delighting in this. And we have to talk about it. And to bring on an expert, somebody who can talk about this from the perspective of a lawyer, is our friend Pisco, lawyer, host of Pisco's Hour, and my co-host of Live and Learn. So we're going to look at the clip in just a second. But actually, you know what? Let's just go ahead and do this now, and then we'll get your reaction on the other side, Pisco. But again, this is from the Oval Office, Donald Trump and Bukele.
Can President Bukele weigh in on this? Do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm supposed to have suggested that I smuggle a terrorist into the United States, right? How can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
So you can release him inside El Salvador?
Yeah, but I'm not releasing, we're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. We just turned the murder capital of the world into the safest country of the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into the releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? No, that's not going to happen.
They'd love to have a criminal, released into our country.
There's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
They're sick.
So we're going to play one other clip to really drive this home, because again, it's just shocking, and then we'll get Pisco's reaction to it. It's just totally stunning. This is Caitlin Collins from CNN following up with Trump, saying, "Well, didn't you just recently say that if the Supreme Court ordered you to return Bukele, that you would?"
You said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago. And they said that it must be facilitated.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over? And that's why nobody watches you anymore. You have no credibility. Please go ahead.
President Trump.
Okay, so we've got more clips. Again, even Stephen Miller weighs in. He tries to reinterpret the Supreme Court's decision. We'll get to all of that. But Pisco, what is your initial reaction to this?
Yeah, classic authoritarian moves. They're an open defiance, as you suggested, of the Supreme Court of the United States, which said that they have to facilitate, his release from custody from El Salvador, his return to the country, which held unanimously that this was an unlawful deportation under no authority and in explicit violation of the law. So it's a extremely big deal. It's grounds absolutely for impeachment, and it's a troubling sign of where we are in the country. You heard there, by the way, that Bukele said, "I don't have the power to return them to the United States." So on the one hand, you have Trump, who in another clip says that he does not have the power to take him from El Salvador, and Bukele, who says he doesn't have the power to bring him to the United States. And so who does have this power, actually? The Supreme Court was very clear. You had to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia and his release from custody from El Salvador. And Trump just said there, he's not even going to try. He's not even going to try, and he's clinging to this narrative that J.D. Vance promoted, that Stephen Miller promoted, that he's promoting, that his attorney general is promoting, that he's a member of MS-13, that he's a terrorist, that he's a gang member, based on no evidence whatsoever. It's a preposterous thing to say. On the one hand, if you look at the actual Fourth Circuit opinion on this, that it's based on the fact that he wore some clothing, and hearsay from one individual who said he was a prominent member of New York gang, in which he was never living in New York. And so even just based on the face of it, they're not arguing with evidence that he's a member of MS-13. But just take a step back. He was granted withholding of removal in 2019 under Trump's first term. If he was a prominent member of MS-13, as they claim, why didn't they do anything about it in 2019? Why didn't they appeal the granting of withholding of removal in 2019? Are they letting like prominent MS-13 members into the country in 2019? And so it defies all logic. The truth is they're letting him suffer and wail away in a Salvadorian gulag because they're authoritarians and because they don't want him to speak out. Now that he sees the conditions of the other political prisoners that the administration has sent to El Salvador, they don't want anyone else knowing about that.
Yeah, it really is shocking. And again, we've got some other clips to play on this particular topic. I mean, there's so much was said in that meeting about other topics as well, which were truly unsettling. But I really want to focus on this. Now, you've been in your own content, as we discuss on Live and Learn as well, so on two different fields of content. You've been tracking the Trump administration's violation of court orders, be they district court orders, circuit court orders, appellate court. Do you consider this a defiance of the Supreme Court?
Absolutely. There's an order from the Supreme Court that said they must facilitate the release of Kilmar from El Salvadorian custody. And what he just said is he's not going to do that. And what he just said is he's not even going to ask President Bukele to do that. He is flouting the Supreme Court's order. In another clip, Pam Bondi says the only thing the Supreme
we're going to
Court...
play that one. We'll play that one for context. So I guess let's turn to this one here. So you have your interpretation of the Supreme Court's recent unanimous decision. Stephen Miller, the Deputy White House Chief of Staff for Policy, has a different interpretation, Pisco. So let's hear it.
I promise you, if he was your neighbor, you would move right away.
So you don't plan to ask for
Supreme Court's asking to...
And
that-
what was the ruling
that your
in the Supreme Court, Steve? Was it 9-0?
Yes, it was a 9-0
In our favor.
in our favor against the district court ruling, saying that no district court has the power to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. As Pam said, the ruling solely stated that if this individual at El Salvador's sole discretion was sent back to our country, that we could deport him a second time.
Well,
No version of this legally ends up with him ever living here because he is a citizen of El Salvador. That is the president of El Salvador. Your questions about it, per the court, can only be directed to him.
So, Pisco, let's address that.
Yeah.
What do you make of Stephen Miller's interpretation of the Supreme Court's ruling?
Stephen Miller is a lying weasel. He is a corrupt, barely human individual standing there lying about what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court at no point said that the only thing that they're empowered to do is receive him when they choose to send him over. The Supreme Court was clear. The United States must take measures to facilitate his release from El Salvadorian custody. That was a holding unanimously by the Supreme Court. And now he's trying to reinvent it like any good fascist and say that it was in their favor. They are absolutely cooked. These are authoritarians. They're running their country. They're illegally occupying the White House and spreading their filth on the airwaves. They should all be impeached. And frankly, everyone involved in this whole saga should be arrested and investigated for, criminal kidnapping and torture of Kilmar. And so I take nothing of what Stephen Miller says seriously for what the Supreme Court said, and obviously take nothing of what the Department of Justice says about the Supreme Court's opinion in terms of its accuracy.
So let's look at the reaction of some other people in Trump's orbit, particularly cabinet officers. Like you mentioned, Attorney General Pam Bondi, so did Stephen Miller. So we're going to start with her, and then we're going to look at Lil Marco Rubio.
Let's hear the question from this very low-rated anchor at CB.
Thank you, President. Do you plan to ask President
Low
Bukele
rating.
to help return the man who your administration says was mistakenly
Which one is it?
deported? The man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador?
Well, let me ask Pam, would you answer that question?
Sure, President. First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, two courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
So, Pisco, before we move on to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, is there anything you want to say specifically on that front and about Pam Bondi?
Yeah, I mean, just they're all worms, every single one of them. And what they just said is inaccurate about what the Supreme Court said. I've told you already about the MS-13 holding. That was, related to a custody bond situation where, unfortunately, the immigration courts are bound to accept the findings if they're based in some of these reports of the immigration officers. But like I said, it's completely corroborated by the facts, and the predicate was incredibly weak, as now the Fourth Circuit has held and the District Court has held, and the Trump administration is not even bothering to show facts that he's a prominent member of MS-13. And if that's true, then they're admitting that they released a, quote, prominent member of MS-13 into the country in 2019. And what's more important, notice what Pam Bondi said there. It's just a paperwork offense, she says. That's what they think of due process in this country. Oh, it's just paperwork. Notice, an opportunity to be heard. Who needs it? It's just an additional paperwork. Who cares? And then she says, we're not even going to ask Bukele to bring him back, just foreign affairs. And the Supreme Court ruled in our favor. It's disgusting. Every single one of these individuals, like I said, needs to be impeached, removed from office, and arrested on kidnapping charges.
So we're going to play one more clip, this one of Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And then the last clip we'll play is actually in some ways the most chilling clip of all. And it portends ill omens to come for American citizens of all people.
These are sick people. Marco, do you have something to say about
Yeah, I mean, Stephen outlined it. I don't understand what the confusion is. This individual is a citizen of El Salvador. He was illegally in the United States and was returned to his country. That's where you deport people, back to their country of origin, except for Venezuela that wasn't refusing to take people back, or places like that. I can tell you this, Mr. President, no, the foreign policy of the United States is conducted by the President of the United States, not by a court. And no court in the United States has a right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. It's that simple.
Again, anything to say about Marco Rubio and Marco Rubio's assessment of the situation, and whether or not the court, whether or not the Supreme Court of the United States has any, if basically a foreign policy is justiciable by the Supreme Court of the United States?
Marco Rubio is an enemy of the American people. He's an enemy of the Constitution. What he says there is that we don't have to listen to the Supreme Court. But we know from Marbury versus Madison, it is emphatically the providence and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. And so when he says, we get to decide what things are, what we're going to listen to and what we're not going to listen to, what the law is, he's claiming the powers of the king. He wants to be a king. He wants a dictator. And so when you hear him right there say, we don't have to listen to any court, even when they tell us to bring someone back, he's saying that if we deport some U.S. citizens to an El Salvadorian prison, a gulag, and all of a sudden the Supreme Court says, hey, you can't do that, it's against the law, the court, even if they order the Trump administration to bring that U.S. citizen back, they don't have to listen to that court, and they won't listen to that court. Extremely dangerous, nasty guy, Marco Rubio, enemy of the American people.
So you mentioned deporting citizens. Let's end on this. That's the most ominous clip of all of these. Here's Donald Trump talking about doing just that.
Are you willing to pay for those facilities to be opened if new ones were going to be built?
I'd do something. We'd help them out. Yeah, we help them. They're great facilities, very strong facilities, and they don't play games. I'd like to go a step further. I mean, I said it to Pam. I don't know what the laws are. We always have to obey the laws, but we also have homegrown criminals that push people into subways, that hit elderly ladies on the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that are absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country, but you'll have to be looking at the laws on that, Steve, okay?
So seems to me that was the president of the United States who, to me, he either is so incredibly ignorant that he's unfit for office, or he knows what the law says about the unilateral deportation of American citizens, that he's just he's either incredibly dangerously ignorant or incredibly dangerously authoritarian. But there is the president of the United States openly musing about deporting American citizens to gulags in foreign countries.
Yeah, it's sick. It's sickening. And he said, we'll have to see what the law says. They lie about the law, and they lie about the facts, right? They lie about what the Supreme Court says. They lie about what the law says. The law says that you can't deport him, Kilmar, to El Salvador. Despite what Marco Rubio said, there's a law that provides for withholding of removal, and they violated it. So they don't care what the law says, and they lie about the facts. They lie about whether he's a member of MS-13. They lie about whether or not he, is a terrorist. They lie about practically everything. And so when they say, yeah, we'll deport U.S. citizens, but only if it's within the bounds of the law. They're going to lie about what the law says. And if they say, yeah, we'll deport U.S. citizens, but only if they're hitting grandmas with bats, they're going to lie about whether they're hitting people with grandmas with bats. And so you can't trust this administration to get anything right. And the minute they would be granted the authority, or if they would take the authority without any pushback from members of Congress or other officials, they would abuse that authority and they would target political enemies. They're already doing it. They're going after the weak first, but they're going to come for you, your family, the people you love. And you have to ask yourself, are you going to let them do that?
So sorry about that. We experienced some rage-induced technical difficulties. Like my head exploded and I think it like fried the computer here. So Pisco, I'm going to give you the final word on this, which is, after all this, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think every single Democratic member of Congress needs to stand up and call for the impeachment of President Trump for violating the Supreme Court. I think every single Democratic candidate that's up and coming and who has any eyes towards the White House needs to affirm that they need a full investigation, criminal investigation of everyone involved in this entire fiasco. And we need to put some officials behind bars. Otherwise, they're never going to learn. They're never going to learn that they can't violate the law and get away with it that easily.
Well said. I don't even know what any of this is going to look like, but obviously we'll keep track of it. I'm sure we'll be discussing on Live and Learn. I'm sure you'll be covering it on your own channel. And speaking of which, where can people find you?
Pisco's Hour on YouTube, Pisco Liddy on Twitter.
All right, perfect. We'll keep monitoring this. I'm sure we'll be discussing it again in the near future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.